Here are a few tips to think about when using the extroversion introversion facets. These facets are initiating or receiving, expressive versus contained, gregarious or intimate, active versus reflective, and finally enthusiastic versus quiet. Starting with initiating and receiving, people on the initiating side tend to say it's relatively easy for them to show up at social events and pretty much talk about anything with people at that small talk level. Whereas those who prefer receiving tend to feel like it's like pulling teeth at times to come up with things on the fly. So something that might help for people who report receiving is to find a role. Find something to do at those events, like keeping an eye on the buffet table or passing out drinks. If you're the host, maybe even set up an activity like cards or games so it gives them something to do. Next up, under the extroversion-introversion facets, we have expressive and contained. This is about communicating feelings, thoughts, and interests. People on the expressive side tend to find it relatively easy to talk about personal, in-depth information about themselves. As a result, they might at times share too much personal information. So they need to keep in mind not everyone wants to hear it. Whereas those on the contained side tend to come across more private, and so when you ask them what seems like an innocent question, it might end up shutting them off. Those personal questions you ask as an attempt to help people open up might instead close them down. Continuing with the extroversion and introversion facets, we're now at gregarious and intimate, the breadth and depth of our connections. People who report gregarious tend to not distinguish between friends and acquaintances, and in fact tend to call a lot of people their friends. Whereas those who report intimate are more about close connections with maybe one or two people at any given time. I report intimate, and while I like people, only about one or two people do I call true friends at any point in my life. Active and reflective is about how we prefer to learn and participate. Over on the active side, it's about learning face to face. It's needing to talk things out. Sometimes I describe extroversion, or people who prefer extroversion, with the example of, I don't know what I'm thinking until I hear myself say it. That's active. Versus over on the reflective side, I report reflective, I need some time to sit and think about what I want to say before I say it. If you ask me to share too soon, you're not going to get the best part of me. So give me that time I need to reflect and think about it before I need to share it. And then finally we get to enthusiastic and quiet, the last of the extroversion-introversion facets. People who report enthusiastic tend to like to be where the action is. If you have a party, they're often the people who are surrounded by others telling a story. I know people who report enthusiastic, and I've heard their stories many times. I will say at times it seems like they're embellishing just a bit when I hear those stories over and over again. Now, it doesn't mean they're lying, it just makes it more interesting for them, more enthusiastic, if you will, when they can add more elements to it. Whereas those who report quiet, they tend to be more uncomfortable when they're the center of attention. So a way to reward someone who reports quiet is to let them have that reward in a quiet way. Making them get up in front of a whole bunch of people to recognize them may not be the best way to reward them. Now let's spend time with the sensing intuition facets. They are concrete abstract, realistic imaginative, practical conceptual, experiential theoretical, and traditional original. Starting with concrete abstract. This is about how we perceive the world and what we focus on. We find that people who report concrete tend to notice specifics and details, and they tend to remember those details. People who report abstract, on the other hand, they might tend to focus more around landmarks, big picture ideas. Ask them directions from their house to the airport, and they'll likely give you more big picture ideas, or even say that way, as opposed to knowing all the specifics and details like those who report concrete would. The next facet, realistic and imaginative, is about common sense versus what we can imagine. I find that people who report realistic tend to like owning useful things. I have a colleague who, when her husband gave her flowers one year for her anniversary, she said to him, "Never give me flowers again, they die." Instead, she recalls one year her husband gave her a coffee maker for their anniversary, and when she makes coffee every day, she remembers, "This is from my husband." Those of us over on the imaginative side, it really tends to be more of a "what can I imagine" perspective. People who report imaginative might never use all the cool gadgets and tools on the TV that they just bought, but knowing that they might use them someday is often enough. To continue the sensing and intuition facets, we come to practical and conceptual. This is how ideas are used. For people who report practical, when they're learning something new, they want to know how they can practically apply it. And so if you don't include that kind of information for them, you might end up losing them. Versus those over on the conceptual side, often learning for the sake of learning is kind of fun. You might find those who report conceptual watching Food Network shows hours on end, never having any intention of cooking anything they saw on those shows. The idea of learning for the sake of learning is often kind of fun for people on this side. Then we get to experiential and theoretical. This is about the kind of information and knowledge that we trust. People on the experiential side basically trust evidence first and foremost. If someone has a great new idea and he doesn't back it up with the data and proof and evidence that someone who reports experiential might need, then they're likely not going to trust it. Versus those on the theoretical side, if theoretically it sounds like a good idea, then they might say, why not? Why can't we be the first to give it a try? In my neighborhood, a restaurant opened up called Cooking Papa. And to me, the words cooking and Papa sound like a great restaurant, so why can't we be the first to give it a go? And now we come to the last sensing and intuition facet, traditional and original. This is about the approach to traditions. We find that people who report traditional tend to value whenever a holiday or some rule and regulation is in place, they value that you follow it the way it's meant to be followed. These are often the people who set up rules and regulations, and they get really annoyed when those who report original break those rules and regulations, especially if they break them just because they're bored. So if you report original, which is my preferred side, I need to ask myself, am I changing it to make it better, or am I changing it just because I'm bored doing it the same way? People who operate on the original side like to think of new, novel ways to get things done. Sometimes it means we look a bit different. And by the way, sometimes we like that about ourselves, looking kind of different, being unique. Now let's look at the thinking and feeling facets on the MBTI Step 2. These 5 facets are logical versus empathetic, reasonable versus compassionate, questioning or accommodating, critical versus accepting, and finally tough or tender. The first thinking and feeling facet is logical and empathetic. We find that people who report logical tend to start a decision in a rather objective, impartial way, whereas those who report empathetic tend to consider how that decision will affect other people. Take a decision like you need to make a budget cut. People on the logical side usually think first about the line items, what needs to get cut. Whereas people who report empathetic right away go to, oh no, how will that budget cut affect people? Moving to the next facet, we come to reasonable versus compassionate. This is about that criteria that we actually use to make and carry out a decision. One way to understand this facet is with the difference each side relates to the word fair. On the reasonable side, being fair means you treat everybody the same. Over on the compassionate side, fair means you can't treat everybody the same because people are different and you need to take into account those differences. The third thinking and feeling facet is questioning versus accommodating, and this is about the ways we approach differences. I often like to ask people who report questioning, have you ever been given feedback that you ask too many questions? And often they will reply, yeah, they have been. Often what that's about for people who report questioning is they are looking for the objective truth, and that's why they like to ask those questions. Over on the accommodating side, I like to ask, are there times that you can be too accommodating? And often they will accommodate with, yeah, there are times that I can be. And I just remind people when we over-accommodate, sometimes what happens is people then make decisions for us, or they might assume that we're not even interested because we're just going along. Next, we come to critical versus accepting. And we find for people on the critical side, they can sometimes be given feedback that they are too critical. Now, what that's about is when they look at making a decision, they look to see what's wrong so that they can correct it. However, sometimes overusing that approach, that's why they can be seen as overly critical. Over on the accepting side, looking for a win-win is often a big part of those people who report accepting. However, getting a win-win is sometimes really hard to achieve, and when they don't get that, you can find it can be a real downer for them. And finally, we get to the last thinking and feeling facet, tough versus tender. This is about how we carry out that decision. Those on the tough side of this facet tend to implement the decision in a just do it way. If they're going to take off a bandage, for example, they just take it off and move on. Slowly removing a bandage tends to prolong the pain, so why not just cut to the chase? Those on the tender side tend to implement the decision using a more gentle approach. Sometimes why they do that is because in the end they want to be liked. This can backfire when wanting to be liked sometimes means they soften the message so much that people don't really get to know what they're really saying. Next, we're going to look at the judging and perceiving MBTI Step 2 facets. These facets are systematic versus casual, planful versus open-ended, early starting or pressure prompted, scheduled or spontaneous, and finally methodical versus emergent. The first judging and perceiving facet is systematic versus casual. This is our general organizational style. We find that people who report systematic tend to not like surprises. Coming in on Monday morning, they typically have an idea of what they're going to do. And if you say to them, hey, we're going to drop this and do that instead, it's going to be fun, that's not necessarily going to be seen as fun for people who report systematic. Whereas those who report casual, they might find it kind of fun just to drop what they were planning to do and do something that just comes up. Moving to the next facet, planful versus open-ended, that approach to planning or about leisure and long-term life events. On the planful side, this is where I'm at a preference. Sometimes, for example, when it comes to planning leisure events, I'll plan them well in advance. That might mean at times I'm not too flexible when things change, and so I have to keep in mind, especially when it's leisure, I can maybe relax just a little bit more. Over on the open-ended side, that's about just deciding what you're going to do when you're going to do it. Now, that's a great approach, but sometimes it might mean you miss out because you haven't made those reservations early enough, and then you don't get to do the things in the end that you might want to do. Continuing with the third judging and perceiving facet, early starting, pressure prompted. I find this one is where I often see conflict in work settings, where you have someone who reports early starting on one side and someone who reports pressure prompted on the other. That person who reports early starting may start things a bit too soon, and when she does that, may be closed off to new information. Someone who reports pressure prompted, while she doesn't necessarily have to start earlier, she does need to remember that sometimes if she waits too long, it might get a bit overwhelming in the end. It works for me to use that pressure prompted approach as long as my work is also excellent. Like with all of our preferences and all of our facets, if our work is excellent, great. But if not, how do we learn to flex to the other side when it's appropriate? The fourth judging and perceiving facet is scheduled and spontaneous. This is about schedules and routines. We find that people who report scheduled often like to write lists of things they're going to do that day, and they like to check things off as they complete them. If they complete something that's not on their list, they tend to add it to their list and give it a check mark too. There seems to be a real sense of satisfaction for them to do that. People who report spontaneous also write lists, but mainly because they see people who report scheduled writing lists and thinking they're supposed to do that too. However, these lists tend to be things they're going to do someday. I've noticed that people who report spontaneous write lists on things like napkins or pieces of scrap paper, which of course they occasionally lose. And finally, the last judging and perceiving facet, we get to methodical on one side, emergent on the other. This is about approaching those larger tasks to completion. The methodical approach is about outlining what they're going to do before they do it. The emergent approach is just jumping in and getting it done, starting maybe even in the middle and seeing where they go from there. Both approaches work great, of course, Both approaches can be overused. So like all of our preferences and all of our facets, I always like to ask, how do you use these results? Meaning, how do you use your facets, and how might your facets use you? If things aren't working for you, think about flexing to the other side when it's appropriate.